Hey everyone, CW Music Reviews here. I'm CW and this is going to be a music review of the new Swans album, The Glowing Man. Swans is the long-running project fronted by singer-songwriter, producer, multi-instrumentalist Michael Gira. These guys have been around since the early to mid-80s, and since then they've experimented with a lot of different sounds, styles, and genres as a whole. They go from like no wave to anti-folk and like gothic rock, kind of a folk rock, post-punk, post-rock, just all this stuff, noise rock, and it's just kind of vast what Swans have experimented with since the 80s, and it was pretty unfortunate that they had to break up around like the late 90s after their big double album, Soundtracks for the Blind. Since then, Michael Gira has been pretty much doing this side project of his called Angels of Light, a sound that would carry on to the Swans album that they would drop around 2010, My Father Got Me Up Road to Heaven, if I remember the album title right. Lots of really neo-folkish type sounds with a lot of ambition to them. Not a very lengthy project, it's about 40 minutes in length, but I dig it. It's definitely a good Swans album. Not one of their best, but it certainly adds on to the consistency that they would go on to drive through with their next album, The Seer. Fantastic album. Listen to it if you haven't. About almost 2 hours of drone, post-rock, post-punk, noise, neo-folk. God, there's so many sounds to like this one single project, and I can hardly contain myself just talking about it. The Seer was actually the album that got me into Swans, and I'm pretty much one of those people that didn't hop on to the Swans until they came back, which seems to be quite a bit of Swans fans in general, and that's received a lot of criticism, but I personally believe that it's better late than never how you decide to gain new fans. What better way to gain new fans than to start putting out quality material one album after another? And they seem to have done that with To Be Kind, which, while it's not my favorite Swans album, I will agree that this may be their best. Pretty much Gira took the sound that they had with The Seer and refined it. Really made it stand alone and intricate. More intricate than The Seer, which I admire a lot. And there was a lot of lyricism that was really abstract but also direct about just human nature as a whole, and yeah, it's just a very fantastic album and one that I enjoy experiencing quite often. It's also an album that leads me to contemplate whether or not it's my favorite or The Seer is my favorite. So now we have this new album from Swans, The Glowing Man, and I wasn't sure what to expect from it, apart from what was already introduced to me from excerpts of the title track as well as the big actual lead single to the album, When Will I Return. The song had Jennifer Gira, Michael Gira's wife, singing like lead vocals, and it had kind of like a acoustic ballad type thing going on. It's like a 6-minute cut, one of the shortest tracks on the record. It certainly works as a teaser to what the album has in store, as it's got quite a bit of progression going for it, and around like the halfway point, like, the build really sells the song quite well. So I was really looking forward to what Michael Gira had in store for Swans fans and music in general when he said that this was going to be the last Swans record. And I gotta say, if this is the last Swans album, I'm pretty pleased with how it's coming out. It's actually probably my favorite album of this month. This album's about 8 tracks in length, about 118 minutes long. So there's quite a bit of ambition here, certainly. The average track ranging from like 10 to 20 minutes, somewhere in the middle. Obviously there's 3 tracks that go way under that, but for the majority of the time you're getting tracks that are over 10 minutes and 3 of them that are over 20. Kind of a big undertaking Swans have going for them. And I started getting an idea when I listened to Cloud of Forgetting. It's a good intro track. I certainly dig the post-rock direction that they're going in for this album. If there's one thing I have to notice about this track and the album as a whole, it's more of a post-rock vibe than it was like the ambiguous progressive post-punk thing that they were going for To Be Kind and The Seer. The track essentially has a patiently strung acoustic guitar going on for a majority of the track, as Michael Gira's like signature weapon, the crescendo, is slowly being used and like doesn't fully present itself until around the tail end of the track, where it all just kind of breaks down with all this noisy guitar and off-kilter piano just guiding itself out for 3 minutes. I love how dense the instrumentation eventually gets. It's definitely something that I dig from a Swans album, or this incarnation of Swans for that matter. Although I do have the complaint with this track and the majority of tracks here that the production doesn't feel as crisp. John Congleton is not on production this time. It's Gira pretty much manhandling the whole project, and the way he produces doesn't really do the sound the complete justice of what a Swans performance, since I also caught them live, as well as a Swans album in general, should have in store for a listener, but it certainly works. It doesn't really undermine the album all that much. Moving on to the next track, Cloud of Unknowing. This is one of my favorite tracks on the record. It starts off with like these really weird and off-kilter strings going on, just kind of like meandering around for like a good 4 to 5 minutes, and it's really off-kilter and unnerving the way these strings are just really going off. There's some build that comes out all of a sudden, and it definitely adds to the density to what this album and Swan's signature sound in general would have in store. Then after that, the groove kind of comes in. It's another like kind of steady and patience testing kind of groove with like this dun 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 dun. It doesn't get tiring at all. I think if there's one thing that Swans mastered over time, it's putting the listener into a state of catharsis, and this catharsis is incredibly enjoyable and just really attention grabbing the way it ensnares the listener. Like this track in here sounds kind of like this really occult and really primal like march through the desert of some kind. Like they're all just slowly going to the sun and shriveling up and just becoming nothing but dust or something of that nature. After this, there's kind of like a primal drone thing, I think, and the track just gets even more primal and rather just animalistic over time, and I dig it quite a bit. The groove pretty much disappears and just goes into like this really ominous and off-kilter and just wild and visceral and dense moment that is just really breathtaking, that I can barely describe it. And you gotta understand, this happens twice in the track, within the 20-something minutes that this goes on. I couldn't bet on any other post-rock influenced or post-rock band to write compositions that remain this interesting throughout the course of the length that it goes on for. Gira seems to be on his off-kilter and postmodern-ish lyricism here, where with To Be Kind he had like kind of a coherent message, but all the while kind of manic type of delivery and syntax. Here it's like Gira is like past that, and he's just, for the most part, have gone some kind of insane. Maybe even like putting on the persona of someone that is incredibly delusional. And that's the case with a good chunk of the tracks here. And I guess that's why this album's called The Glowing Man. Like, you have this guy that seems incredibly charismatic and he's absolutely glowing, but when you get closer to him and the way he seems to be operating as an individual, he's really just like glowing with radiation, and anyone that like gets near him is afflicted. And over time, they just burn out. Moving on, where we get the track The World Looks Red, The World Looks Black, which is a kind of a two-parter song. First part, once again, has a pretty off-kilter atmosphere to it. There's like some buzzing synth going on in the background that I dig quite a bit. Or at least it sounds like synth. I think it might be like some kind of brass, certainly, or maybe it is a synth and I'm just wrong. Because the track does have quite a bit of horn coming in over time. It really adds to the overall build to the track here. And it goes on for 7 minutes before it gets into the second half, The World Looks Black. There's like a more upbeat vibe to it. I kind of like how slightly tropical the percussion gets. It's definitely different for the album as a whole. I like the refrains on this track, whether it's the horns or the vocals, like coming in syncopation. I know the sleeper man, I know the secret man. Then we get the shortest track on the album, People Like Us. Probably my least favorite track on the record. It's not a bad track, it's just not like fully developed, but I think that might have been intentional since Jira maybe wanted to give the listener kind of a break or some kind of interlude. Once again, adds to like the desertish and occultish vibe that this album as a whole had going for it. I will give it to Jira for at least making the lyricism here pretty coherent and pretty occult and pretty in a narrative type way. I certainly dig that about the track, as he seems to be talking about like him and I guess his followers, or maybe he is a follower for like this glowing man that this album had presented from the title and eventually within the album. That I guess he's talking about how they're like following him and eventually they just become nothing but dust. I do like the send us away type of vocal delivery that comes up on the tail end. It kind of reminds me of like a more strange and more really eerie type version of the track The Warrior that was on Swans this year. And then we get another over 20-minute cut, Frankie M. You get like this really borderline dark ambient type stuff that just forte piano and crescendos like over and over and over again, and I dig it. It definitely adds to like the catharsis that Swans' songwriting likes to do. The track just kind of low-key goes nuts in a way. There's like this foreboding wall of sound and just noise that really is really ear-grabbing and keeps me engaged. It definitely builds particularly well on this track before it eventually goes into the main groove that the track has going for it. Pretty much Jira, I guess, singing about Frankie M. I haven't fully looked up who Frankie M is. He was either this former mayor or he was like this actor that died at a young age. I do like the rhyme scheme that he goes for, pretty much rhyming Frankie M with opium, heroin, MDM, kind of taking like a drug angle to this track. And the track just like guides particularly well from there. It's definitely a really good track and it demonstrates how great of a songwriter that Michael Jura is. Then we get that teaser single, And Will I Return, and in the context it's kind of out of place in a way, but regardless it's still a good cut before we get my favorite track on the album, The Glowing Man, the title track. It starts off pretty soft and spacey before you get this like noisy guitar going on and Jira pretty much getting manic. Here's a real go-getter. And this builds particularly well before we get to this like really pummeling and outright visceral thing of catharsis that reminds me of like the title track off of The Seer, as well as like Bring the Sun off of To Be Kind. Just outright bar just over and over. It just does itself in like a little after there's like some drum fills that like gets thrown in, as if like, oh man, that's one thing I dig about Swans. They just do not let up when they have like something like this going on. It's like they have like the stamina of an ox when they're just doing shit like this. The track then dissipates a little bit before it just comes back in with like a driving groove that I really dig a lot. At the end of each line that Jira says here, there's like this like really dense and just outright chaotic going on. It's unspeakable in a way. This song just kicks my ass and I love it. And then the closing track, Finally Peace. Not really a favorite of mine in the track listing. It's like a calm down period for the album as a whole. I do like the beautiful piano that's on this track. But with this track, it's like Swans are finally laying to rest what they have built up for 7 tracks. And it works particularly well. I don't understand why it's 6 minutes long, but it definitely works. So overall, I do need to answer like 2 questions about this album. Is this album great? And where does it rank in Swans' discography? Well, for me personally, I do love this album quite a bit. It's definitely a favorite of mine for the month as well as the year. I don't think Swans outdid themselves, since To Be Kind will always be the best Swans album within this realm of Swans era. But regardless, I do think that they have sent off this project in such good fashion. I definitely dig how they've done that. If you're a Swans fan, you'll definitely want to try this out. If you're a fan of post-rock and I guess noise rock and post-punk and just I guess rock music in general, you're definitely going to want to give this a try. While this isn't my favorite Swans album, it definitely adds on to the consistency that they have set for themselves since My Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope. If this really is to be the last Swans album, then I'm definitely pleased with this Swan song that they have delivered to me. This album is a plus 2.6 out of plus 3. It's a real shame that Michael Gira is going to lay this project to rest, because this is the kind of rock music that really is pretty vibrant and pretty interesting and borderline envelope pushing in a way. But regardless, we are left with the legacy that this band has left behind, and we should be grateful that they came back to deliver at least 3 or 4 more albums of really good material. But if you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you like this album? Did you dislike this album? What was your reasoning for that, and what should I consider listening to and reviewing next? CW Music Reviews here, signing off.